The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Colonel Marcus Hayes walked toward the shooting range. His boots crunched against the gravel path, each step echoing his years of experience in the Army. At 52, he had seen countless recruits come and go, but today felt different. Today, he was meeting someone who had specifically requested to join his elite sniper unit. Sarah Chen stood quietly near the equipment shed, her small frame almost lost among the towering male soldiers around her. At 24, she looked more like a college student than someone seeking to become one of the military's deadliest shooters. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her dark eyes held a determination that caught the colonel's attention immediately. "You must be Chen," Colonel Hayes said, approaching her with measured steps. His voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, standing straighter. Her voice was steady, but the colonel noticed the slight tremor in her hands. Nervousness was common among new recruits, but something about Sarah seemed different. The colonel studied her for a moment. Her file had been impressive on paper, but he had learned long ago that paperwork meant nothing when bullets started flying. What mattered was what happened when someone held a rifle and had to make the shot that could save lives or end them. "Tell me why you want to be here," he said, crossing his arms. Around them, other soldiers continued their training exercises, the sound of gunfire echoing across the range. Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "My brother was killed in action 3 years ago, sir. He was a sniper in Afghanistan. Before he died, he wrote me a letter saying that the best way to honor fallen soldiers was to become better than they ever were." The colonel's expression softened slightly. He had heard many reasons why people wanted to join the military, but personal loss often created the most dedicated soldiers. It also created the most dangerous ones if they couldn't control their emotions. "Revenge isn't a good reason to become a sniper." "Chen," he said firmly. "It's not about revenge, sir," Sarah replied quickly. "It's about precision. My brother taught me that every shot matters because every shot could save someone else's brother or sister." The colonel nodded slowly. "Show me your hands." Sarah extended her hands, palms up. The colonel examined them carefully, noting the calluses on her fingertips and the steady way she held them. These weren't the soft hands of someone who had never worked hard. "Have you ever fired a weapon before?" he asked. "Yes, sir. My father took me hunting when I was young, and I've been practicing at civilian ranges for the past 2 years. Hunting deer is different from what we do here," the colonel warned. "We don't just shoot at targets. We shoot at people who are shooting back." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I understand, sir." The colonel led her toward the equipment room where the rifles were stored. The M24 sniper weapon system stood in a locked case, its sleek design both beautiful and deadly. The rifle had been the backbone of American military sniping for years, and the colonel had personally trained hundreds of soldiers to use it effectively. "This is the M24, he explained, unlocking the case. "It weighs just over 12 pounds and can accurately hit targets at distances most people can't even see clearly. It requires not just good eyesight, but patience, discipline, and the ability to remain calm under pressure." Sarah listened intently as he explained the rifle's specifications. The M24 fired 7.62mm rounds and had an effective range of over 800 meters in the right hands, but the colonel had seen expert marksmen who couldn't hit anything under combat stress. "The first thing you need to understand," the colonel continued, "is that being a sniper isn't about being the best shot on the range. It's about being invisible, patient, and making decisions that other people can't make." He handed her the rifle, watching carefully as she accepted it. Sarah held the weapon with respect, not fear. Her hands found the proper grip naturally, and she kept the barrel pointed in a safe direction without being reminded. "How does it feel?" the colonel asked. "Heavy," Sarah admitted, "but balanced." The colonel smiled slightly. It was the right answer. Many recruits tried to impress him by claiming the rifle felt light or perfect. Sarah's honesty was refreshing. "We'll start with basic marksmanship," he said, leading her toward the shooting range. "But I want you to understand something first. If you make it through my training, you'll be responsible for taking lives. That's not something you can take back, and it's not something everyone can live with." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I've thought about that, sir. I know what I'm asking to become." The shooting range stretched out before them, with targets set at various distances. Other soldiers were already practicing, their shots ringing out in steady rhythms. The colonel led Sarah to a firing position at the 100-meter mark. "We'll start here," he said, Show me what you learned from your father. Sarah took a prone position, settling the rifle against her shoulder. The colonel watched as she adjusted her position, noting how naturally she seemed to find her comfort zone. She controlled her breathing, lining up the shot with methodical precision. Take your time, the colonel advised. There's no rush here. Sarah remained still for nearly a minute, her eye focused through the scope. The colonel could see her finger resting lightly on the trigger, applying gradual pressure rather than jerking it. When the shot finally came, it surprised even him with its clean execution. The target showed a hit just outside the center ring. Not perfect, but impressive for someone handling an M24 for the first time. Again, the colonel said simply. Sarah took another shot, this one slightly closer to center, then another and another. With each shot, the colonel watched her growing more comfortable with the rifle's weight and recoil. After 10 shots, he called for a ceasefire and walked with her to examine the target. 8 of the 10 shots had hit within the scoring rings, with 2 very close to the center. Not bad for a first try, the colonel admitted. But this is just the beginning. Tomorrow we start the real training. As they walked back toward the equipment shed, Sarah carefully carried the M24, treating it with the respect it deserved. The colonel found himself cautiously optimistic about this new recruit, but he had learned not to get too excited too early. The real test would come when the pressure increased and the stakes became real. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's first day on the range, and the colonel found himself increasingly puzzled by her progress. Each morning she arrived 30 minutes early, spending the extra time cleaning and inspecting her assigned M24. Her dedication was obvious, but dedication alone didn't explain what he was witnessing. The morning training session began like all the others. Sarah took her position at the 300-meter range, a distance that challenged even experienced shooters. The wind was picking up, creating conditions that would test her ability to compensate for external factors. Chen, show me what you've learned about wind reading, the colonel instructed, standing behind her with his binoculars ready. Sarah studied the flags positioned along the range, watching how they moved in the shifting breeze. She picked up a small handful of dirt and let it fall, observing how the wind carried it. These were techniques the colonel had taught her, but she seemed to understand them intuitively. Wind is coming from the northeast at approximately 8 miles per hour, she reported. It's gusty, so I'll need to time my shots between the stronger gusts. The colonel nodded approvingly. Wind reading was one of the most difficult skills for new snipers to master, yet Sarah had grasped it faster than anyone he had ever trained. Sarah settled into her shooting position with fluid movements that had become second nature. Her breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm he had taught her, and her body relaxed into perfect stillness. Through his binoculars, the colonel watched the target downrange, waiting to see where her shot would impact. The rifle fired with its familiar crack, and the colonel immediately focused on the target. The shot had hit dead center, a perfect bullseye despite the challenging wind conditions. Again, he said, trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. Sarah fired 4 more shots in quick succession, each one finding the center of the target with mechanical precision. The colonel lowered his binoculars and stared at her with growing amazement. "How are you doing that?" he asked directly. Sarah looked up from her rifle, genuine confusion on her face. "Doing what, sir?" "Those shots. In these wind conditions, even experienced snipers would struggle to group shots that tightly. I'm just doing what you taught me, sir. Watch the wind, control my breathing, squeeze the trigger smoothly." The colonel frowned. He had taught her those fundamentals, but what she was demonstrating went far beyond basic instruction. There was something almost supernatural about her ability to read conditions and place shots exactly where she wanted them. "Let's try something different," he said, walking to the equipment box. He pulled out a spotting scope and set it up next to her position. "I want you to tell me what you see when you look through your scope." Sarah peered through the rifle scope toward the target. "I see the target, sir. The wind is moving the grass about 2 inches to the right of the target post. There's a small bird sitting on the frame about 6 inches above the bullseye." The colonel looked through his spotting scope, which had much higher magnification than her rifle scope. He could barely make out the bird she had mentioned, and he certainly couldn't see the grass movement in that much detail. "Describe the bird," he said. "It's a sparrow, sir. Brown and gray feathers. It's facing toward the left side of the range." The colonel adjusted his scope to maximum magnification and focused carefully. There was indeed a small sparrow on the target frame, and it was facing left just as Sarah had described. but she should not have been able to see those details through her rifle scope at 300 meters. "Chen, I want you to move back to the 500-meter line," he said slowly. Sarah gathered her equipment and moved to the more distant firing position. At 500 meters, targets became much smaller and harder to see clearly. Wind effects were magnified, and even tiny mistakes in technique resulted in missed shots. "Same target," the colonel instructed. "Show me 5 shots." Sarah took her time setting up at the new distance. She studied the wind flags again, but the colonel noticed she was also watching things he couldn't see clearly. She seemed to be reading subtle signs in the grass, the trees, and even the heat shimmer rising from the ground. Her first shot at 500 meters hit the center ring. The second shot hit even closer to the bullseye. By the 5th shot, she had created a grouping that would have impressed national-level competition shooters. The colonel stood in stunned silence. In 25 years of training snipers, he had never seen raw talent like this. Most soldiers required months of intensive training to achieve accuracy at 500 meters, and many never reached this level of precision. "Where did you learn to shoot like this?" he asked, his voice betraying his amazement. Sarah seemed genuinely surprised by his reaction. "My father taught me the basics when I was young, sir. But mostly I just practice a lot and try to pay attention to everything around me." "Tell me about your father's teaching." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. He was different from other fathers. "He used to take me hunting, but he never let me shoot at animals unless we needed the meat. He said killing should only happen when necessary, and every shot should be perfect because wasting ammunition was disrespectful to the animal." The colonel listened intently as Sarah continued. "He taught me to watch everything. The way leaves move, how animals behave, where shadows fall. He said shooting was only 10% about the gun, and 90% about understanding the world around you." "What did your father do for work?" "He was in the military too, sir. Special forces. He died when I was 16. Pieces began falling into place in the colonel's mind. Special forces soldiers often possessed exceptional marksmanship skills, and they sometimes had access to training that regular infantry never received. If Sarah's father had passed on advanced techniques, it might explain her unusual abilities. "Did he teach you anything specific about reading wind or judging distances?" Sarah nodded. "He taught me to watch for things most people miss, like how dust moves differently at different heights or how heat waves can tell you about wind direction changes before the flags show it." The colonel realized he was witnessing something rare. Sarah wasn't just applying the techniques he had taught her. She was using advanced fieldcraft that took most soldiers years to develop. Her father had apparently given her a foundation that went far beyond basic marksmanship. "I want to try something," the colonel said, walking to his equipment bag. He pulled out a rangefinder and handed it to her. "Tell me the distance to that water tower beyond the far end of the range." Sarah looked toward the tower without using the rangefinder. "Approximately 1,200 meters, sir." The colonel activated the rangefinder and pointed it at the tower. The digital readout showed 1,247 meters. Sarah had estimated the distance to within 50 meters using only her eyes. "How did you know that?" "Size comparison, sir. I know the targets on the range are standard size, so I used them as reference points to estimate the distance to the tower." The colonel shook his head in disbelief. Distance estimation was one of the most critical skills for a sniper, and it typically required extensive training and practice. Sarah was doing it naturally, as if she had been born with the ability. As they packed up the equipment, the colonel found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about training snipers. Sarah wasn't just learning quickly. She was demonstrating skills that shouldn't have been possible for someone with her limited experience. Tomorrow, he decided he would test her under more challenging conditions. The colonel decided it was time to test Sarah under conditions that more closely resembled actual combat. He had arranged for a special training exercise that would challenge not just her shooting ability, but her mental toughness and decision-making skills. At dawn, Sarah found herself lying in tall grass on a hillside, overlooking a mock village that the military used for urban combat training. The colonel had positioned himself 50 meters behind her with a radio and observation equipment. Between them and the village, other soldiers were conducting a training exercise that would create noise, movement, and distractions. "Your mission today is different," the colonel explained through her earpiece. "There are 6 targets hidden throughout the village. Some are legitimate threats, others are civilians. You need to identify and engage only the hostile targets while avoiding any harm to non-combatants." Sarah adjusted her position behind the M24, scanning the village through her scope. The distance to the nearest buildings was approximately 600 meters, well within the rifle's effective range but far enough to make target identification challenging. Rules of engagement are strict, the colonel continued. You cannot fire unless you can positively identify a hostile target and confirm there are no civilians in the line of fire. Take your time and think through each decision. Through her scope, Sarah could see soldiers moving through the village streets. Some wore the standard combat uniforms that marked them as friendly forces, while others wore civilian clothes that could indicate either non-combatants or disguised enemies. The challenge was determining which was which from a distance of over half a kilometer. Sarah spent nearly 30 minutes observing before she spotted her first potential target. A figure in civilian clothes was crouched behind a building, holding what appeared to be a rifle. But something made her hesitate. Contact at 2 o'clock behind the blue building. She reported quietly into her radio. Appears to be armed, but I need more confirmation. The colonel watched through his spotting scope as Sarah continued to observe the figure. Most trainees would have taken the shot immediately upon seeing someone with a weapon, but Sarah was demonstrating the patience and caution that separated good snipers from dead ones. He's watching the patrol that just passed, Sarah continued, but he's not taking a shooting position. I think he might be one of our observers. The colonel smiled grimly. Sarah had correctly identified a training instructor who was positioned to evaluate the patrol's performance. Shooting him would have resulted in an automatic failure of the exercise. 20 minutes later, Sarah identified her first legitimate target. A figure in civilian clothes had taken a concealed position in a second-story window and was clearly aiming at the patrol below. There were no civilians visible in the area, and the target presented a clear threat. Hostile target, second-floor window of the white building, Sarah reported. Clear field of fire, no civilians in the area. You are cleared to engage, the colonel responded. Sarah's shot was perfect, striking the target dummy squarely in the chest. The range safety officer immediately confirmed the hit and marked the target as eliminated. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah systematically identified and engaged 4 more legitimate targets, while correctly avoiding 2 additional decoys. Her patience and accuracy were impressive, but what amazed the colonel most was her ability to read the tactical situation. How did you know the man behind the water tank wasn't a threat? The colonel asked during a brief break in the exercise. His body language was wrong, sir, Sarah explained. He was hiding, but he wasn't watching the patrol. Real hostiles focus on their targets. He was looking around like someone who was lost or scared. The colonel nodded approvingly. Sarah was demonstrating tactical awareness that went beyond marksmanship. She was reading human behavior and making complex judgments that many experienced soldiers struggled with. As the exercise continued, the conditions became more challenging. The training scenarios included moving targets, poor lighting conditions, and time pressure. Sarah adapted to each new challenge with remarkable composure. During one particularly difficult scenario, she was required to track a moving target through a crowd of civilians. The target was armed and dangerous, but taking the shot required perfect timing to avoid hitting innocent bystanders. Sarah followed the target through her scope for nearly 10 minutes, waiting for the right moment. Several times she had clear shots but held her fire because civilians were too close. Finally, the target moved into an alley where he was momentarily isolated. The shot came as a complete surprise to the colonel. He had been watching the same scenario and hadn't seen the window of opportunity that Sarah had identified. The target was eliminated cleanly with no risk to civilians. Explain that shot, the colonel requested. The target paused to look around the corner, Sarah said. For about 2 seconds, he was completely separated from the crowd. It was the only safe opportunity. The colonel reviewed his notes from the exercise. Sarah had engaged 6 targets with 6 shots, all of them hits. More importantly, she had correctly identified and avoided 8 decoy targets that could have resulted in simulated civilian casualties. Outstanding work today, the colonel said as they packed up their equipment. But I want to understand something. Your tactical decision-making is far beyond what I would expect from someone with your experience level. Sarah looked thoughtful as she secured the M24 in its case. My father used to tell me stories about his missions, sir. He never gave me classified information, but he talked about the importance of patience and making sure you understood the whole situation before acting. What kind of stories? He told me about times when taking a shot would have been easy, but waiting for the right moment saved lives. He said the hardest part of being a sniper wasn't making difficult shots, it was knowing when not to shoot. The colonel found himself increasingly curious about Sarah's father. The level of tactical sophistication she was demonstrating suggested training that went beyond normal special forces instruction. Did your father ever mention where he learned his sniper skills? Sarah hesitated for a moment. He didn't talk much about his training, sir. But sometimes he mentioned instructors who taught him things that weren't in any manual. As they walked back toward the base, the colonel realized that Sarah's abilities might have deeper roots than he had initially thought. Her father had apparently passed on not just shooting techniques, but a complete philosophy of precision engagement that emphasized restraint and tactical awareness. The question that troubled him was whether Sarah truly understood the weight of what she was learning to do. Her technical skills were advancing rapidly, but tomorrow he would need to test something even more important: her ability to handle the psychological pressure of actually taking a human life. The colonel decided it was time for the most challenging test of all. Sarah's technical skills had progressed beyond anything he had seen before, but being a military sniper required more than just accuracy. It required the mental strength to take human lives when necessary, and the wisdom to live with those decisions afterward. He had arranged for a special psychological evaluation that would test Sarah's readiness for actual combat deployment. The exercise would use advanced simulation technology to create scenarios that felt as real as possible, without actually putting lives at risk. Sarah entered the simulation facility with no idea what to expect. The room contained sophisticated equipment that could create realistic combat environments using a combination of virtual reality, live actors, and advanced target systems. Today's exercise is different, the colonel explained as technicians fitted Sarah with monitoring equipment. You'll be placed in scenarios that simulate real combat situations. The stress will be real, the pressure will be real, and your decisions will have consequences. Sarah nodded, understanding the seriousness of what she was about to face. The colonel had explained that this evaluation would determine whether she was psychologically ready for deployment or if she needed additional training. The first scenario placed Sarah in a simulated urban environment where she was tasked with providing overwatch for a patrol that had come under attack. Through her scope, she could see enemy combatants taking positions to ambush her fellow soldiers. The realism was startling. She could hear gunfire, explosions, and radio chatter from the patrol calling for help. Her heart rate increased as she identified targets and calculated the shots needed to protect her teammates. The first shot felt different from anything she had experienced in training. Even though she knew it was a simulation, the weight of taking a life hit her immediately. The target dropped and she moved to the next threat, but her hands were shaking slightly. "Stay focused," the colonel's voice came through her earpiece. "Your team is counting on you." Sarah forced herself to concentrate, taking deep breaths and applying the mental control techniques she had been taught. The second shot was steadier, and by the third she had regained her composure. The simulation ended with the patrol successfully reaching safety. "How do you feel?" the colonel asked as the equipment was reset for the next scenario. "Shaken," Sarah admitted honestly. "Even knowing it wasn't real, it felt like I was actually killing people." The colonel appreciated her honesty. Many trainees tried to act tough during psychological evaluations, claiming that taking lives didn't affect them. Sarah's emotional response was actually a positive sign, indicating that she understood the gravity of what she was training to do. The second scenario was even more challenging. Sarah was positioned to eliminate a high-value target, but the target was surrounded by civilians, including women and children. She had to wait for the perfect moment to take the shot without endangering innocent people. For over an hour, Sarah watched through her scope as the target moved through a crowded marketplace. Several times she had clear shots but held her fire because civilians were too close. The pressure was enormous, knowing that allowing the target to escape could result in future attacks on her own forces. Finally, the target moved into a narrow alley where he was momentarily isolated. Sarah took the shot, eliminating the threat cleanly, but the psychological impact was even greater than the first scenario because of the extended period of stress and decision-making. "Talk to me about what you're feeling," the colonel said during the break between scenarios. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "It's harder than I expected, sir. Not the shooting, but the responsibility, knowing that other people's lives depend on my decisions." That's exactly what separates real snipers from people who just know how to shoot, the colonel explained. The technical skills are only part of the job. The mental aspect is what determines whether someone can handle the reality of combat. The third scenario was the most difficult yet. Sarah was placed in a situation where she had to make a split-second decision about whether to engage a target who might or might not be a threat. The scenario was designed to test her judgment under extreme pressure. Through her scope, she saw a figure approaching a checkpoint where her fellow soldiers were stationed. The figure was carrying something that could have been a weapon or could have been innocent cargo. She had seconds to decide whether to take the shot or risk letting a potential bomber reach her teammates. Sarah's training kicked in. She observed the figure's body language, movement patterns, and behavior. Something about the way the person was walking suggested nervousness but not hostile intent. She held her fire and reported her assessment to the ground team. The figure turned out to be a local civilian carrying medical supplies to the checkpoint. Sarah's decision not to shoot had prevented a tragic mistake that could have had serious diplomatic consequences. "Excellent judgment," the colonel said after the scenario ended. "That was the hardest decision you'll face as a sniper. When in doubt, you have to trust your training and your instincts." The final scenario tested Sarah's ability to function under sustained stress. She was required to provide overwatch for an extended operation that lasted several hours. During this time, she had to remain alert, make multiple engagement decisions, and coordinate with ground forces while dealing with fatigue and psychological pressure. Sarah performed flawlessly throughout the extended exercise. Her shooting remained accurate, her decision-making stayed sharp, and she maintained effective communication with her team. Most importantly, she demonstrated the mental resilience needed for long-duration missions. When the evaluation was complete, Sarah felt emotionally drained. The simulations had been more intense than anything she had experienced, and the psychological impact was significant. "How do you assess your performance today?" the colonel asked as they debriefed the exercise. "I think I did well technically, sir," Sarah replied. "But I understand now that being a sniper is about much more than just shooting accurately. The mental and emotional challenges are bigger than I realized." The colonel smiled approvingly. "That understanding is what I was looking for. Many trainees focus only on the technical aspects and ignore the psychological realities. You've shown that you can handle both." He reviewed his notes from the evaluation. Sarah had demonstrated exceptional shooting skills, sound tactical judgment, and appropriate emotional responses to the stress of simulated combat. Her psychological profile indicated someone who could handle the responsibilities of a military sniper while maintaining the moral compass necessary to make difficult decisions. "I'm recommending you for advanced training," the colonel announced. "You've shown that you have both the technical skills and the mental strength needed for this role." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had passed a crucial test, but she also understood that her training was just beginning. The real challenges would come when she faced actual combat situations where lives truly hung in the balance. That evening, as Sarah cleaned and maintained her M24, she thought about her father and the lessons he had taught her. His emphasis on responsibility and restraint had prepared her for this moment, but she knew that the path ahead would test everything she had learned. 6 months after beginning her training, Sarah received orders for her first deployment. The destination was a forward operating base in a conflict zone where insurgent activity had been increasing. The colonel would be accompanying her unit as the senior sniper instructor, but Sarah would be operating as a full member of the team rather than a trainee. The flight to the deployment area gave Sarah time to reflect on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a civilian with a dream of honoring her fallen brother. Now she was a trained military sniper, carrying an M24 and heading into actual combat. The forward operating base was a stark contrast to the training facilities she had grown accustomed to. Concrete barriers, razor wire, and heavily armed guards created an atmosphere of constant alertness. The sounds of distant gunfire and helicopter rotors reminded everyone that this was a real war zone. Colonel Hayes briefed Sarah and the other members of their sniper team on the current tactical situation. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent snipers had been targeting coalition patrols from positions in the surrounding hills. Their mission was to locate and eliminate these threats while providing overwatch for friendly forces. "The enemy snipers are skilled and experienced," the colonel explained during the briefing. They know this terrain better than we do, and they've been using hit-and-run tactics that make them difficult to locate. Sarah studied the maps and aerial photographs of their operational area. The terrain was mountainous with numerous hiding places and long sight lines that favored defensive positions. Finding enemy snipers in this environment would require patience, skill, and careful observation. Their first mission came the following morning. Sarah and her spotter, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, were assigned to provide overwatch for a convoy moving through a valley that had been the site of several previous attacks. They took positions on a ridge overlooking the route, approximately 800 meters from the road. "This is where it gets real," Sergeant Rodriguez said as they set up their equipment. "Everything you learned in training matters now, but there's always something different about actual combat." Sarah felt the familiar weight of the M24 as she settled into her firing position. The rifle had become an extension of herself over the months of training, but today it felt heavier somehow, loaded with the responsibility of protecting real lives. Through her scope, Sarah scanned the hills on the opposite side of the valley. Enemy snipers would likely position themselves in locations that offered good fields of fire, while remaining concealed from observation. She looked for the subtle signs that might reveal hidden positions, unnatural shadows, unusual vegetation patterns, or small movements that didn't match the natural environment. The convoy began moving through the valley right on schedule. Sarah tracked the vehicles through her scope while simultaneously scanning for threats. Sergeant Rodriguez provided commentary and additional observations through his spotting scope. Movement at 11 o'clock, approximately 200 meters, Rodriguez reported quietly. Sarah shifted her aim to the indicated area and focused her scope. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then, barely visible among the rocks and scrub vegetation, she detected the outline of what appeared to be a rifle barrel. "I see it," Sarah confirmed. "Looks like a sniper position in the rocks above the bend in the road." They observed the position for several minutes, confirming that it was indeed an enemy sniper preparing to engage the convoy. The range was at the outer limit of effective engagement distance, but it was within the capabilities of the M24 and Sarah's demonstrated skill level. "You have positive identification of a hostile target," the colonel's voice came through their radio. He was monitoring their position from the command post. "You are cleared to engage." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she prepared to take her first shot in actual combat. This wasn't a training exercise or a simulation. The person in her scope was a real enemy, who posed a genuine threat to the soldiers in the convoy below. She controlled her breathing and settled into the familiar rhythm she had practiced thousands of times. The wind was minimal, and the range was well within her capabilities. Every aspect of her training came together as she applied pressure to the trigger. The shot felt different from any she had taken before. The recoil was the same, the sound was the same, but the knowledge that she had just taken a human life created an emotional impact that no amount of training could fully prepare her for. "Target down," Sergeant Rodriguez confirmed through his spotting scope. "Clean hit, threat eliminated." The convoy continued through the valley without incident, unaware that they had just been saved from a potential ambush. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction at protecting her fellow soldiers and somber reflection on what she had just done. "How are you holding up?" Rodriguez asked as they continued their overwatch mission. "I'm okay," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "It's different from training, but I knew it would be." Over the following days, Sarah and her team conducted several more missions. Each one built her confidence and experience, but also deepened her understanding of the realities of combat. She engaged 3 more enemy combatants during that first week, each shot carefully considered and precisely executed. The colonel observed Sarah's performance with growing amazement. Her accuracy under combat conditions was extraordinary, but what impressed him most was her consistent demonstration of sound judgment and emotional stability. Many snipers struggled with the psychological impact of their first combat deployments, but Sarah seemed to be adapting remarkably well. "You're performing better than snipers with years of experience," the colonel told her during a debriefing session. "Your technical skills are exceptional, but your tactical awareness and decision-making are what really set you apart." Sarah appreciated the praise, but she remained focused on the mission rather than personal recognition. "I'm just trying to apply everything you taught me, sir, and I think about what my father would have done in each situation." The mention of her father prompted the colonel to ask a question that had been troubling him. Sarah, I need to ask you something about your father's background. Some of the techniques you're demonstrating go beyond what most Special Forces soldiers learn. Are you sure he never told you about any specialized training he might have received? Sarah looked thoughtful. He never talked about specific programs or units, sir. But he did mention once that he had worked with some very elite instructors who taught advanced reconnaissance and precision engagement techniques. The colonel nodded slowly. He was beginning to suspect that Sarah's father might have been involved in highly classified special operations that went beyond conventional Special Forces missions. The level of fieldcraft and tactical sophistication that Sarah had inherited suggested training at the very highest levels of military special operations. As their deployment continued, Sarah's reputation began to spread among the soldiers at the forward operating base. Word of her exceptional shooting abilities and tactical success reached other units, and she began receiving requests to provide support for increasingly important missions. The colonel realized that he was witnessing the emergence of a truly exceptional sniper, someone whose abilities might reshape how the military thought about precision engagement and long-range support. But he also knew that Sarah's greatest challenges still lay ahead. 3 weeks into the deployment, Sarah faced her most challenging mission yet. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, who was responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The target was meeting with other insurgent leaders in a compound, located in a heavily defended area of the city. The mission required Sarah to infiltrate an urban environment where enemy forces were actively searching for coalition snipers. She would need to move through hostile territory, establish a concealed position, and wait for the target to present himself for engagement. The level of risk was significantly higher than anything she had faced before. Colonel Hayes personally briefed Sarah on the mission parameters. "This target has been responsible for the deaths of dozens of our soldiers," he explained. "But the location is extremely dangerous. You'll be operating alone, deep in enemy territory with limited support options." Sarah studied the detailed maps and satellite photographs of the target area. The compound was surrounded by multi-story buildings that offered numerous potential sniper positions, but also created multiple hiding places for enemy forces. Getting into position would require careful route planning and exceptional stealth skills. "The shot distance will be approximately 650 meters, the colonel continued. "Well within your capabilities, but you'll need to account for urban wind patterns and potential obstacles." The insertion was planned for the early morning hours, when enemy activity was typically at its lowest. Sarah would move through the city using predetermined routes that avoided known enemy positions and surveillance points. Once in position, she would have to remain hidden for up to 12 hours waiting for the target to appear. Sarah spent the evening before the mission preparing her equipment and reviewing every detail of the plan. She cleaned and inspected her M24 with particular care, knowing that equipment failure could be fatal in such a dangerous environment. The rifle that had become her trusted companion would need to perform perfectly when the moment came. The insertion went smoothly. Sarah moved through the dark streets like a shadow, using the urban terrain to mask her approach. Her father's lessons about observation and patience served her well as she avoided enemy patrols and surveillance positions. She reached her designated building just before dawn and carefully made her way to the roof. The position offered an excellent view of the target compound while providing good concealment from observation. Sarah settled into her hide and began the long wait for her target to appear. Hours passed without any sign of the high-value target. Sarah remained motionless in her concealed position, enduring the discomfort of staying in one place for an extended period. The urban environment created its own challenges, with constantly changing wind conditions and the need to remain invisible to civilians and enemy forces moving through the area. At midday, Sarah's patience was rewarded. Through her scope, she observed several vehicles arriving at the compound. Armed men emerged and took security positions around the building. This level of security suggested that important people were meeting inside. Sarah continued to watch and wait. Taking a shot at the wrong person could compromise the mission and alert the real target to the danger. She needed to be absolutely certain of her target's identity before engaging. 2 hours later, a figure emerged from the compound that matched the description and photographs of the high-value target. Sarah studied him carefully through her scope, confirming identifying features and comparing them to the intelligence briefing materials. There was no doubt that this was the person she had been sent to eliminate. The target stood in the courtyard of the compound, apparently giving instructions to his subordinates. The range was exactly 647 meters, well within Sarah's demonstrated capabilities. The wind was light and variable, but nothing she couldn't compensate for. Sarah controlled her breathing and settled into the shooting position she had practiced thousands of times. The weight of the mission pressed on her consciousness, but her training took over. This shot would potentially save the lives of many coalition soldiers who would otherwise fall victim to this man's planning. The M24 fired with its familiar crack, and through her scope, Sarah saw the target collapse immediately. The shot had been perfect, striking exactly where she had aimed. The enemy leader was eliminated, but now Sarah faced the challenge of escaping from a hostile area that would soon be swarming with angry insurgents. Shouts and gunfire erupted from the compound as the target's bodyguards realized what had happened. Sarah quickly broke down her position and began moving toward her extraction route. Speed and stealth were both critical now, as enemy forces would be searching for the sniper who had just eliminated their leader. Sarah moved through the building and down to street level, using her planned escape route to avoid the areas where enemy forces were likely to concentrate their search. The sounds of vehicles and shouting indicated that a major manhunt was beginning, but Sarah's careful route planning kept her ahead of the search teams. She reached the extraction point just as enemy forces were beginning to establish roadblocks and search perimeters. The helicopter that picked her up reported heavy ground fire during the extraction, but Sarah was safely recovered without injury. Back at the forward operating base, Sarah was debriefed on the mission by Colonel Hayes and other senior officers. The elimination of the high-value target was considered a major success that would significantly disrupt enemy operations in the region. Outstanding work, the colonel told her privately after the formal debriefing. That was one of the most challenging urban sniper missions we've attempted, and you executed it flawlessly. Sarah felt satisfaction at the mission's success, but she was also aware of how much she had learned about herself during the operation. Operating alone in enemy territory had tested every aspect of her training and mental strength. She had proven to herself that she could handle the most demanding challenges that a military sniper might face. Word of Sarah's successful mission spread quickly through the military intelligence community. Her combination of exceptional shooting skills and tactical competence was attracting attention from special operations units that were always looking for talented snipers, Colonel. Hayes received several requests for Sarah to be transferred to other units, but he was reluctant to let her go. He recognized that he was working with someone who had the potential to redefine excellence in military sniping. I've been offered a position with a joint special operations task force, Sarah told him one evening as they reviewed mission plans. They want me to work on high-priority targets across multiple theaters. The colonel wasn't surprised by the offer. Sarah's abilities had reached a level where she would naturally be recruited by the most elite units in the military, but he also felt a responsibility to ensure that she was ready for the increased demands and dangers that such assignments would bring. That's a significant opportunity, he said carefully, but it would also mean operating in extremely dangerous environments with minimal support. Are you sure you're ready for that level of responsibility? Sarah considered the question seriously. I think my father would have wanted me to use my abilities where they could do the most good. If I can save more lives by taking on harder missions, then that's what I should do. The colonel realized that Sarah had grown beyond anything he had imagined when she first arrived for training. She was no longer just an exceptional student. She had become a professional warrior with the skills and judgment to operate at the highest levels of military special operations. 1 year after Sarah first picked up an M24 on the training range, Colonel Hayes found himself preparing for what would be his final mission with her. Sarah had accepted the position with the Joint Special Operations Task Force, but she had requested to complete one last operation under his command. The mission was unlike anything they had undertaken before. Intelligence had identified a terrorist leader who was planning a major attack against civilian targets. The target was hiding in a remote mountain compound that was heavily fortified and defended by experienced fighters. Traditional assault methods would result in heavy casualties and might allow the target to escape. Sarah's mission was to eliminate the terrorist leader from extreme range, beyond the effective distance of the compound's defensive weapons. The Shot would need to be made from over 1,500 meters away, pushing the M24 rifle system to its absolute limits and requiring unprecedented precision. "This is the most challenging shot we've ever attempted," Colonel Hayes explained during the mission briefing. "At that range, you'll be dealing with bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric conditions that could affect the shot's trajectory. Even the smallest error will result in a miss." Sarah studied the ballistic calculations and weather data for the target area. A shot at 1,500 meters would require her to aim several feet above and to the side of her actual target to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift. The margin for error was measured in inches. The approach to the shooting position would be equally challenging. Sarah and Colonel Hayes would need to climb through difficult mountain terrain while carrying their equipment and avoiding detection by enemy patrols. Once in position, they would have only one opportunity to take the shot before enemy forces located their position. They began the infiltration in the early morning hours, moving carefully through rocky terrain that offered good concealment but made progress slow and difficult. Sarah carried her M24 and essential equipment, while Colonel Hayes served as her spotter and carried additional ammunition and communication gear. The climb took 6 hours, with frequent stops to avoid enemy patrols and observe the target compound through binoculars. By midday, they had reached a position that offered a clear line of sight to the target area, at a measured distance of 1,547 meters. Sarah set up her rifle carefully, using the natural terrain to create a stable shooting platform. At this extreme range, even the smallest movement could throw off her shot by several feet. She adjusted her scope for the distance and began the meticulous process of calculating all the variables that would affect the bullet's flight. "Wind is variable between 5 and 8 miles per hour from the northeast," Colonel Hayes reported from his spotting scope. "Temperature is 72 degrees, humidity is low. Atmospheric pressure is slightly below normal for this altitude." Sarah made adjustments to her scope settings and shooting position based on these conditions. The shot would push both the rifle and her own skills to their absolute limits. Everything she had learned about precision shooting would need to come together for this one critical moment. They waited for over 3 hours before the target appeared. Through her scope, Sarah could barely make out the figure that intelligence had identified as the terrorist leader. At 1,500 meters, even with maximum magnification, the target appeared tiny and indistinct. "Target confirmed," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "You have a clear field of fire." Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the final preparation for the shot. Her breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm she had practiced countless times. Her body relaxed into perfect stillness, becoming one with the rifle and the environment around her. The calculations ran through her mind automatically. Bullet drop at this range would be approximately 15 feet. Wind drift could add another 3 feet of deviation. She aimed high and to the left of where she could see the target, trusting in the mathematics and her own training. The shot felt different from any she had ever taken. The sound of the rifle seemed to echo forever in the mountain valleys, and the bullet's flight time to the target was nearly 2 full seconds. For those 2 seconds, Sarah could only watch through her scope and hope that all her calculations had been correct. "Hit," Colonel Hayes confirmed through his spotting scope. "Target down. Perfect shot." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and amazement. She had just made what was possibly the longest successful sniper shot in the history of her unit, eliminating a dangerous terrorist from an almost impossible distance. The technical achievement was remarkable, but more importantly, the mission had succeeded in preventing planned attacks against innocent civilians. The extraction from the mountain position was rapid and intense. Enemy forces had located their general area and were moving to intercept them. Sarah and Colonel Hayes moved quickly down the mountainside, using alternate routes to avoid the search. Teams that were climbing toward their former position. They reached the extraction point just as helicopter gunships arrived to provide cover. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to reflect on what she had accomplished and what it meant for her future. Back at the forward operating base, news of the successful long-range elimination spread quickly through the command structure. Senior officers who had been skeptical about Sarah's abilities were now convinced that they were dealing with someone truly exceptional. "That shot will be talked about for years," Colonel Hayes told Sarah during their final debriefing session. "You've just redefined what's possible with the M24 system." Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she was more focused on the lives that had been saved by preventing the terrorist attack. "I just want to know that the training you gave me is being used to protect people who can't protect themselves." The colonel smiled with pride at her response. After a year of training and deployment, Sarah had maintained the moral compass and sense of purpose that had brought her to military service in the first place. Her exceptional skills were matched by equally exceptional character. "Your new assignment will give you opportunities to make an even bigger impact," he said. "But I want you to remember that your greatest strength isn't your shooting ability. It's your judgment and your commitment to doing the right thing." As Sarah prepared for her transfer to the Special Operations Task Force, she took time to clean and inspect her M24 one final time under Colonel Hayes' supervision. The rifle had become more than just a weapon. It was a tool that had allowed her to honor her brother's memory and protect others from harm. "Take care of yourself out there," the colonel said as they shook hands goodbye. "And remember that everything I taught you was really just helping you discover abilities you already had." Sarah boarded the transport aircraft that would take her to her new assignment, carrying with her the M24 that had become her trusted partner and the lessons that had shaped her into one of the military's most capable snipers. She knew that greater challenges lay ahead, but she also knew that she was ready to face them. Colonel Hayes watched the aircraft disappear into the distance, reflecting on the remarkable transformation he had witnessed. Sarah had arrived as an untested civilian with raw talent and determination. She was leaving as a proven warrior whose skills would serve her country in the most demanding special operations missions. In his final report on Sarah's training and performance, the colonel wrote simply, "This soldier represents the highest standard of precision, judgment, and dedication. She has redefined what I believed was possible in military sniping, and I predict she will continue to exceed expectations in whatever challenges she faces next."